The wind in the New Mexico territory did not just blow, it scoured. It was a living thing, ancient and indifferent, dragging its belly across the scrubland and kicking up red dust that found its way into the seams of boot leather and the creases of a man's soul. It was late summer in the year 1879, and the heat hung heavy over the San Augustine Plains, a shimmering curtain that distorted the horizon and made the distant mesas look like floating islands of purple stone. Jonah Gray stood by the south paddock of Boone's trading post, his gloved hands resting on the rough cedar post of a fence that had been leaning dangerously close to the earth since spring. He did not move for a long time. To a casual observer, he might have looked like a statue carved from the same hard wood as the fence, weathered and still. He wore a hat with a brim wide enough to shadow his face even at high noon, a barrier between his eyes and a world he preferred not to engage with directly. He was a man built of lean muscle and long silences. Under the shadow of that hat, his eyes were dark and watchful, scanning the horizon not with the anxiety of a prey animal, but with the calculated assessment of a man who knew that distance was the only armor worth trusting. He pulled a pair of iron pliers from his belt. The leather of his chaps was worn smooth at the thighs, and his shirt, once a deep indigo, faded to the color of a bruised sky. On the back of his left hand, distinct even under the layer of dust, ran a jagged scar. It was an old mark, raised and white against his copper-toned skin, a souvenir from a life he had folded up and put away in a box he never intended to open again. It was the mark of a scout, a warrior who had once ridden between worlds, translating the silence of the canyons for men who only understood the language of ownership. Now, he translated nothing. He fixed fences. He broke horses. He kept his head down. Jonah gripped the rusted barbed wire, pulling it taut. The metal groaned, a sharp sound that was swallowed instantly by the vastness of the plains. He preferred the work of the ranch. Horses did not lie, wood did not ask questions, iron did not make promises it could not keep. From the main building of the trading post, a voice carried over the wind. It was Red Keene, the cowhand who had drifted in 2 months ago and had not stopped talking since. "I am telling you, Della, it is not just talk this time," Red was saying, his voice high and thin like a coyote's yip. "I saw the wagons in Socorro. They are loaded with surveyor's equipment, brass theodolites, chains, big rolls of paper." Jonah twisted the wire around the post, his movements precise and economical. He did not look up, but his jaw tightened. Surveyors, men who measured the earth so they could slice it up and sell it. He finished the knot and tested the wire with a sharp tug. It was held. He gathered his tools and walked toward the main house, his spurs chiming softly against the hard-packed dirt. The sound was rhythm, steady and grounded, unlike the chaotic clatter of the wind chime hanging by the back door. The trading post was a squat, L-shaped structure built of adobe and timber, fortified against the elements and the uncertainty of the territory. It sat at a crossroads of dust and more dust, a watering hole for freighters, soldiers, and drifters who had nowhere else to be. Jonah stepped onto the porch, scraping the worst of the mud from his boots on the iron blades set into the wood. He pushed the door open and stepped into the dim interior. The air inside was cooler, smelling of cured tobacco, stale beer, and the dry, earthy scent of adobe. Della Boone stood behind the high wooden counter, a ledger open before her. She was a woman in her 50s who looked as if she had been carved from granite. She wore a high-collared dress of severe gray cotton, her hair pulled back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes. She was a widow who had buried a husband and 2 sons in this hard ground, and she ran her station with the ruthlessness of a general and the skepticism of a judge. "Paper does not make a fence." "Red," Della said, not looking up from her column of figures. She dipped her pen into the inkwell with a sharp click. "And maps do not make water flow." Red Keene was leaning against a stack of flour sacks, nursing a tin cup of coffee. He was a young man with a face full of freckles and a desperate need to be important. "It is the railroad contracts. Mrs. Boone," Red insisted, gesturing with his free hand. "They say the government is reviewing the old treaties, the land north of the ridge, the valley where the Apache used to winter. They are calling it public domain now, Open for claim. Jonah walked past them toward the water barrel in the corner. He felt the words hit him like small stones. Public domain. It was a polite way of saying theft. It was a clean way of saying that the people who had lived there for generations, whose bones were knit into the soil, were being erased by ink on a page in Washington. "Jonah," Della said. Her voice was flat, commanding. He paused, the ladle half raised to his lips. He turned slowly, keeping the brim of his hat low. "Ma'am, you check the south line." "Fixed," Jonah said. One word. It was enough. Della nodded, satisfied. She looked back at Red. "You hear that? Red, Jonah fixed the line while you were busy counting wagons in Socorro 3 days ago. Maybe you should worry less about the government and more about why we are short 2 cords of wood for the winter." Red flushed a deep crimson. "I was just saying, that's all. Changes are coming. Big changes. A man has to look out for his opportunities." "A man has to look out for his work," Della snapped. "And right now, your work is in the barn." Red mumbled something into his coffee but pushed himself off the flour sacks and headed for the door, casting a resentful glance at Jonah as he passed. Jonah did not meet his eyes. He drank the water, the liquid cool and metallic on his tongue. "He is a fool," Della said when the door banged shut. "But he is right about one thing. The town is buzzing. Deputy Crow is here this morning." Jonah set the ladle back in the barrel. The name made the muscles in his neck tense. Silas Crow. A man who wore a badge like a hunting license. A man who bought land cheap after ensuring the previous owners met with unfortunate accidents or legal complications. "What did he want?" Jonah asked. His voice was rough, like gravel crunching under a wagon wheel. "Asking about drifters. Asking if we had seen any unauthorized movements from the reservation." Della closed her ledger with a heavy thud. She looked at Jonah, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "I told him the only things moving out here are wind and tumbleweeds, but he sat there for an hour, drinking my coffee, watching the road." Jonah said nothing. He knew what Crow was doing. He was sniffing the air. When men like Crow appeared, it meant there was money to be made from misery. "He asked about you," Della added softly. Jonah went still. "And I told him you are the best hand I have, and you mind your own business, which is more than I can say for him." Jonah nodded a silent thanks. He picked up the empty bucket by the door. "I will fetch the evening water." He went out the back way, through the kitchen. The kitchen of the Boone Trading Post was a large room, intended to be the heart of the house. It had a massive cast-iron stove that took up half the north wall. A beast of black metal with chrome trim that could roast a side of beef or bake a dozen loaves of bread at once. But the stove was cold. It had been cold for seasons. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the shutters. The counters were scrubbed clean, the wood bleached white by lye soap. But there was no life here. No smell of rising dough. No simmering beans. No warmth of a fire kept burning through the night. It was a sterile place, a place where people ate because they had to fuel their bodies, not because they found comfort in the breaking of bread. Jonah walked through the room, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He avoided looking at the cold stove. It reminded him of things he had lost. A fire meant a home. A fire meant someone was waiting. He had neither, and he told himself he wanted neither. He stepped out the back door into the yard. The wind chime hanging from the lintel clattered a hollow, dry sound. It was made of old cattle bones and bits of scrap metal found in the desert, strung together with rawhide. It sounded like skeletons dancing. Clack, clack, ting. Clack, clack, ting. He walked to the well, the bucket swinging by his side. The sky was turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The air was cooling, but the ground radiated the heat it had absorbed all day. Eli Boone was by the trough, brushing down a roan mare. Eli was 14, a quiet boy with eyes too big for his face and a limp from a horse kick 3 years prior. He was the only person on the ranch Jonah tolerated being around for more than 5 minutes. "Evening, Jonah," Eli said, patting the mare's neck. "Eli," Jonah acknowledged. He hooked the bucket to the rope and lowered it into the well. The crank groaned as he turned it. "Red says there is going to be a war," Eli said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He says the surveyors are going to cut up the canyon, and the people won't stand for it." Jonah stopped turning the crank. He looked at the boy. "Red talks to hear his own head rattle." "But Deputy Crow was here," Eli pressed. "I saw him looking at the map in the main room. He traced the line right through the settlements." Jonah hauled the bucket up, the water sloshing over the rim. He set it on the stone lip of the well. "Listen to me, Eli. What happens on a map and what happens on the ground are two different things, but neither of them has anything to do with you. You keep your head down. You do your work." "Like you?" Eli asked. It wasn't an insult. It was a genuine question. Jonah looked at the scar on his hand. "Like me." He picked up the bucket and walked away, leaving the boy standing in the twilight. He knew he was lying. It had everything to do with him. The people in those settlements, they were not strangers. They were the cousins of the mother he had barely known, the kind of the father who had tried to bridge two worlds and been crushed by both. Jonah had walked away from that life. He had cut his hair. He had put on the clothes of a cowboy. He had learned to speak English with the flat, hard accent of a Texan. But the land did not forget. He carried the water back to the kitchen, the weight of the bucket grounding him. He poured it into the reservoir of the cold stove, a mechanical habit. The room was darkening. The shadows stretched long and thin across the floor. Jonah stood there for a moment, in the silence of the dead kitchen. He could hear the wind outside, relentless, trying to find a way in. In this territory, a man alone was a man safe. That was the rule. If you had nothing, nothing could be taken from you. If you loved no one, you could not be used against yourself. Jonah Gray had built a fortress of solitude around his life, brick by brick, silence by silence. But as he stood there, smelling the faint, ancient scent of soot from the cold firebox, he felt a strange unease. It was the feeling of a storm coming before the clouds appeared. It was the prickle on the back of the neck that a scout felt when eyes were watching from the ridge. He turned and walked out to the porch again. The sun was gone. The first stars were piercing the violet sky. They were cold and distant, offering no comfort. He sat on the bench, took out his tobacco pouch, and began to roll a cigarette. His fingers moved with practiced grace. He struck a match on the sole of his boot. The flare of light illuminated his face for a second, the high cheekbones, the sharp nose, the guarded eyes before he shook it out. The smoke curled up into the darkness. Somewhere out there, in the vast blackness of the plains, a coyote howled. It was a lonely, jagged sound. "Surveyors," he whispered to the smoke. He thought of Silas Crow. He thought of the way the deputy smiled. A smile that never reached his eyes. A smile that looked like a crack in a dry riverbed. Crow was not just a corrupt lawman. He was a predator. He was the kind of man who thrived in the chaos of change. If the government was redrawing lines, Crow would be the one holding the pencil, and he would make sure the lines went around the water and through the gold. Jonah knew he should leave. He had stayed at Boone's trading post for 6 months, the longest he had stayed anywhere in 5 years. It was becoming too familiar. Della relied on him. Eli looked up to him. These were dangerous things. Ties, roots. They made a man heavy. They made a man slow. He took a drag of the cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange. "I will leave in the autumn," he told himself. "When the cattle are sold, I will move north, maybe Montana, maybe Canada." But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. The wind chime clattered again, a frantic sound as a gust swept through the yard. The world was holding its breath. The ranch, with its peeling paint and leaning fences, felt fragile tonight. It felt like a small boat on a very large, very dark ocean. Jonah finished his cigarette and ground the butt into the dirt with his heel. He stood up and adjusted his hat. He would do one last round of the perimeter. He would check the horses. He would check his rifle. He walked into the darkness, a shadow moving among shadows. He did not know that the wind was not just bringing dust tonight. He did not know that miles away. Stumbling through the sagebrush with bleeding feet and a heart beating like a trapped bird, was the storm he had been sensing. He did not know that his solitude was about to end, not with a gunshot, but with a whisper. The night deepened. The air grew cold, a biting chill that settled in the bones. Inside the bunkhouse, Red Keene was snoring, dreaming of gold and glory. In the main house, Della Boone was blowing out the lamp, her face lined with worry she would never show. And in the kitchen, the cold stove sat waiting, a black altar in the dark, waiting for the spark that would turn the sanctuary into a home, or burn it all to the ground. Jonah stopped by the gate. He looked south, down the empty road. The moonlight turned the dust into silver mist. "Nothing coming," he said aloud, trying to convince the night. But the wind laughed, a low, dry sound, and kept blowing. He turned back to the bunkhouse, his boots heavy. The day was done. The work was done. But the feeling remained. He lay on his cot in the corner of the bunkhouse, staring up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. He kept his gun belt hanging on the post of the bed, the leather holster within easy reach of his hand. It was a habit from the war, a habit from the years of scouting. You never slept too deep. You never assumed the silence was empty. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the image of the cold kitchen flashed in his mind. He saw a woman standing there, but her face was a blur, a ghost of a thought. He pushed the image away. "Sleep," he ordered himself. He drifted into a light, restless slumber, the kind where the ears stay open. Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutter on the barn, a rhythmic banging that sounded like a gavel striking a desk. Order, law, justice, words on paper. Out here, the only law was survival, and Jonah Gray was a master of that law. He had survived the wars. He had survived the peace. He had survived the loss of his name and his people. He was ready for anything the territory could throw at him, or so he thought. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the trading post, carrying the scent of rain that would not fall, and the whisper of a future that was rushing toward them all at the speed of a terrified heartbeat. The date was August 28th, 1879, the last quiet night of Jonah Gray's life. When he woke, everything would be different. But for now, he slept, and the desert held its secrets for a few hours more. The wind had not ceased its howling when the dogs began to bark. It was not the rhythmic, bored barking of animals baying at the moon, but the sharp, jagged sound of beasts who smelled blood. Jonah Gray was awake before his boots hit the floorboards. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was instant, a reflex honed by years of sleeping on ground that did not welcome him. He grabbed the Colt revolver hanging from the bedpost, the cold metal familiar against his palm. He moved through the bunkhouse in silence, stepping around the sleeping form of Red Keene, who twitched and mumbled in a dream about poker hands he would never win. Jonah slipped out the door and into the swirling dust of the yard. The moon was high and unforgiving, casting long shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the hard-packed earth. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes narrowing against the grit. There, at the main gate, something moved. It was not a horseman. It was not a raiding party. It was a shape too small, too broken to be a threat, yet the dogs were circling it, their hackles raised. Jonah holstered his gun, but did not relax his hand. He walked forward, his spurs chinking softly. As he got closer, the shape resolved into a person, a woman. She was clinging to the gatepost as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Her cloak was a ruin of gray wool, torn at the hem and stained with the dark, wet map of travel and trauma. Dust coated her hair, turning it the color of ash, but it was what she carried that made Jonah stop 3 feet away. In her right hand, gripped with knuckles that had turned white, was a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven. It was absurd. It was madness. A person crossing the San Augustine Plains on foot might carry water, might carry a weapon, but to carry 20 pounds of dead iron was a suicide packed with gravity. In her left hand, she clutched a canvas bag. Even in the moonlight, Jonah could see the dark, stiff patches on the fabric, blood, dried, but plenty of it. Jonah reached for the gate latch. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low enough not to startle her, but hard enough to be heard over the wind. She lifted her head. Her face was a mask of exhaustion. The skin pulled tight over cheekbones that looked sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes were dark hollows, but there was a spark in them, a fierce, terrified defiance that burned like a coal in a dying fire. She looked at him, then at the gun on his hip, then back to his face. She did not ask for water. She did not ask for help. She swallowed, her throat clicking dryly, and spoke. "I do not speak much," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping over stone. "But I can cook." It was a statement of trade, a negotiation. She was offering the only value she had left before she collapsed. Her knees gave way. She did not crumple gracefully. She fell like a tree cut at the root. Jonah moved. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms sweeping under her shoulders. She was terrifyingly light, nothing but bone and fierce will wrapped in dirty wool. But as he caught her, her grip on the canvas bag loosened, and it hit the dirt with a heavy thud. The bag fell open. Jonah looked down. He should have looked away. He should have closed the bag and respected the privacy of the desperate. But he was a scout, and his eyes saw things before his mind could edit them. Inside the bag, nested among a few articles of clothing, was a thick ledger. It was bound in black leather, the kind used by banks and government offices. Stuck between the pages, protruding slightly, was a folded piece of parchment that looked like a map, and stamped on the corner of the visible page, gleaming with the sinister authority of bureaucracy, was a red wax seal. Official land grant, territory of New Mexico. A smaller piece of paper fluttered out, caught by the wind. Jonah snatched it before it blew away. It was a receipt for a survey, dated 3 days prior, signed with a flourish that Jonah recognized even in the dark. He looked at the woman in his arms. She was unconscious, her head lolling back against his shoulder, but her right hand was still locked around the handle of that iron pot. Her fingers were rigid, frozen in a grip that defied unconsciousness. She was holding onto that pot as if it contained her soul. "Trouble," Jonah whispered to the wind. "You brought a whole storm with you." He scooped up the ledger and the papers, shoving them deep into the bag and pulling the drawstring tight. He looked toward the main house. A light had appeared in the window. Della was awake. Jonah hoisted the woman into his arms. The iron pot banged against his hip, bruising him, but he did not try to pry it from her hand. If she wanted to hold on to the hearth, he would not be the one to take it from her. He carried her into the kitchen. Della Boone met him at the door, a kerosene lamp held high, a shotgun tucked under her other arm. She took one look at the woman, the blood on the bag, and the iron pot, and her lips pressed into a thin, white line. "Who is she?" Della asked, stepping aside to let him pass. "Does not have a name yet," Jonah said. He walked to the cold stove and lowered the woman onto the long wooden bench that ran along the wall. He tried to loosen her grip on the pot again. This time, with the woman safe on the bench, her fingers yielded slightly. He took the heavy iron vessel from her. It was blackened with age and use. A good pot, a pot that had fed people. He placed it gently on the floor next to the stove. It sat there, black and solid, a strange promise in a room that had been cold for too long. "She is hurt," Della said, moving closer. She set the lamp on the table and leaned over the woman. "That blood on the bag?" "Not hers, I think," Jonah said. He stood back, crossing his arms. "She has walked a long way, maybe from Socorro, maybe further." Della began to unbutton the woman's collar to check for wounds. "We cannot keep her here. Jonah, look at her. She is running from something. I have enough trouble with the bank in the drought. I do not need the law coming down on us because of a stray." Jonah looked at the bag he had placed on the table. He thought of the red seal. The law was already coming. It was just a matter of who opened the door first. "She says she cooks," Jonah said. Della paused, her hands hovering over the woman's neck. She looked up at Jonah, her eyes skeptical. "She said that, first thing, said she does not talk much, but she cooks. Della looked at the cold stove. She looked at the woman's pale, dirt-streaked face. We have lived on beans and hardtack for 2 years. Jonah, I can cook well enough. You cook to feed, Jonah said quietly. You do not cook to keep a place alive. There is a difference. Della straightened up. She looked at Jonah for a long moment, measuring him. She saw the set of his jaw, the way he stood between the woman and the door. 1 week, Della said, her voice hard. If she wakes up and can stand, she gets 1 week. But if she brings trouble to my doorstep, Jonah Gray, you will be the one to sweep it away. Do you understand? Understood, Jonah said. Della turned back to the woman. Go get the water bucket and wake Eli. I might need him to fetch the doctor from town if she does not come around by morning. Jonah nodded and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he looked back. The woman lay still on the bench, looking small and broken. But the iron pot sat by the stove, catching the glint of the lamplight. It looked like it belonged there. Morning broke with a brutality typical of the territory. The sun slammed into the earth, demanding payment for the cool of the night. Lila Hart woke to the smell of dust and old wood. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Panic, sharp and cold, spiked in her chest. She sat up, gasping, her hands scrambling over the rough wool of the blanket someone had thrown over her. Her hands, they were empty. The pot, she whispered, her voice cracking. Where's the pot? Right where you left it, the voice came from the corner. Lila spun her head, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her neck. A man was standing by the door, the cowboy from the gate. He was leaning against the frame, holding a tin cup. He was wearing his hat, the brim pulled low, but she could see his mouth. It was a hard mouth, unsmiling, but not cruel. Lila looked down. The cast iron pot was sitting on the floor next to the massive, silent stove. It was safe. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 days. She looked back at the man. He was watching her, his dark eyes taking in every twitch of her face. Drink, he said, stepping forward and offering the cup. Lila took it. Her hands shook, spilling a little water on her dress. She drank greedily. It was cool and tasted of deep earth. My name is Jonah Gray, the man said. This is Boone's trading post. You are safe here, for now. Lila lowered the cup. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her mind was racing. The ledger, the map. She looked around wildly for the canvas bag. It is under the bench, Jonah said. I did not open it. He lied. She knew he lied. She could see it in the way he stood, the way his eyes flicked to the bag and then back to her. He had seen, he knew she was carrying something that could get them all killed, but he had not turned her out. I am, she started, then hesitated. My name is Sarah Miller. Jonah did not blink. He took a sip of his own coffee. The distinct lack of rain we are having. Sarah Miller. He knew. He knew it was a lie as clearly as he knew the sun was hot, but he did not call her on it. The door to the main room opened, and the older woman from the night before bustled in. She looked tired, her gray dress crisp but her eyes weary. So, the dead rise, Della Boone said. She walked over to the table and set down a basket of eggs. Jonah says you can cook. Is that true? Or was it just fever talk? Lila stood up. Her legs felt like water, but she locked her knees. She had to stay. She had to stay here, in this middle-of-nowhere place where no one would look for a girl who was supposed to be dead. I can cook, Lila said. Her voice was stronger now. I can make bread without yeast. I can make stew from boot leather if I have enough onions. I can work. Della crossed her arms. We do not have onions. We have flour, lard, beans, and whatever meat the boys bring in. The pay is $2 a week and a roof. You sleep in the loft above the kitchen. And I do not tolerate liars or thieves. Lila felt a cold sweat prickle on her back. I am not a thief, ma'am. We will see, Della said. You have a week. If you are still standing and the food is edible, you stay. If not, you walk." Lila nodded. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Della said. "Get the fire going. The wood is out back." Lila moved toward the stove. She reached for the iron lid lifter, her hand brushing against her own pot as she did. It gave her strength. Jonah watched her. He saw the way she moved efficient, despite her weakness. She knew a kitchen. She knew work. But the peace of the morning was not meant to last. The sound of hoofbeats thundered in the yard. Not one horse, 3, and a buggy. Jonah stiffened. He moved to the window, peering out through the slats. "Crow," he said. The name was a curse. Lila froze. The lid lifter clattered onto the stovetop. Her face went from pale to ghostly white. She looked at Jonah, her eyes wide with terror. "Stay here," Jonah commanded. "Start the fire. Do not come out unless called." He pushed through the door into the main room, Della following close behind. Outside, Deputy Silas Crow was dismounting from a sleek black gelding. He was a big man, heavy in the gut but solid, wearing a frock coat that was too warm for the weather and a badge that shone too bright. He had a face that looked like it had been molded from dough and left out to harden soft features that hid a hard, brittle nature. Behind him were 2 men Lila did not know, but she could see them through the crack in the kitchen door. They wore dusters and carried rifles casually, like tools they used every day. Jonah stepped out onto the porch. He leaned against the post, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "Deputy," Jonah said, "you are far from town." Silas Crow smiled. It was a wet, unpleasant smile. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Duty calls, Mr. Gray. Duty calls." Crow's eyes scanned the yard, the barn, the windows of the house. "We are looking for a lost person, a young woman, troubled mind. I ran off from a wagon train near Socorro 3 days ago. The family is very worried." Della stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "We have not seen any wagon trains. Silas, just the wind." Crow walked up the steps, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. He stopped in front of Della, looming over her. "Is that so? Della, because my tracker found prints leading right up to your south gate. A woman's prints, dragging something heavy." Jonah did not move. Lots of people pass through. They drink at the well and move on. Crow turned his head slowly to look at Jonah. His eyes were the color of stagnant water. "This one is dangerous. Jonah, she steals things, things that do not belong to her. Official things. And she is sick. She tells lies. If someone were to help her, well, they might find themselves in a conflict with the territorial governor." The threat hung in the hot air like the smell of sulfur. Crow stepped past Jonah and pushed the door to the trading post open. He walked in, his spurs jingling. Jonah followed, his hand hovering inches from his gun. Crow walked to the counter, running a finger along the wood. Then he turned and looked at the closed door to the kitchen. "Smells like cold ash in here. Della," Crow said softly. "You really need a cook." He walked toward the kitchen door. Lila stood on the other side, pressed against the wall. She clutched the cold iron of the stove, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could not run. There was no way out that did not lead to an open desert where his men would see her. Crow reached for the handle. Jonah's voice cut through the room, sharp as a whip crack. "She is in there." Crow stopped. He looked back at Jonah, a smirk playing on his lips. "Oh, so you do have a guest." "Not a guest," Jonah said. He walked forward until he was standing between Crow and the door. He did not draw his weapon, but his presence was a wall of stone. "Employee," Crow laughed, a short, barking sound. "An employee since when?" "Since last night," Jonah said. "She is the new cook. She is not a runaway from a wagon train. She is a woman looking for work." Crow narrowed his eyes. "And what is her name? This new cook?" Jonah did not hesitate. "Ask her." He stepped aside and pushed the door open. Lila stood by the stove. She had managed to grab a piece of kindling and was shoving it into the firebox. She turned, her face smeared with soot she had deliberately wiped there to obscure her features. She looked at Crow, and for a second, the terror in her eyes was raw and visible. Crow stared at her. He looked at her torn dress, her trembling hands. He looked at the bag shoved under the bench. He smiled. He recognized the fear. It was the smell he liked best. "Well now," Crow said, stepping into the kitchen. "You look like you have had a hard journey, Miss—" "My name is Sarah," Lila said, her voice shaking but audible. I work here." Crow walked a circle around her. He stopped by the stove and looked down at the cast-iron pot sitting on the floor. He kicked it lightly with the toe of his boot. It rang with a dull, heavy sound. "Sarah," Crow repeated. "A good biblical name. Tell me, Sarah, did you walk all the way here just to cook beans for a washed-up scout and a widow?" "I go where the work is," Lila said, reciting the line she had practiced in her head 1,000 times. Crow leaned in close to her. She could smell the stale whiskey and bay rum on his breath. "You know, Sarah, the law can be very forgiving to those who return what is stolen, but to those who hide it," he let the sentence hang. "It gets very hard for them." Lila did not flinch. She could not. "I have nothing to return. Deputy, just my pot." Crow stared at her for a long count of 10. Then he straightened up and looked at Jonah. "She fits the description. Gray, height, hair, the look of a rat caught in a trap." "She is my cook," Jonah said. His voice dropped an octave. It was the voice he used right before violence happened. "She belongs here. Until she says she does not." Crow looked at Jonah. He saw the scar on Jonah's hand. He saw the way Jonah's weight was shifted to the balls of his feet. Crow was a bully, and like all bullies, he was careful about which fights he picked. He knew Jonah Gray. He knew that killing Jonah would require more than a threat. It would require a war. "Fine," Crow said. He tipped his hat to Lila. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Sarah, but be careful. It is a dangerous country. Things get lost. People get hurt. Houses catch fire." He turned and walked out, his boots loud on the floorboards. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Della. "I will be back. Della, I have to check on the surveys. Keep an eye on your new girl. I would hate for you to be charged with harboring a fugitive." He left. They stood in silence until the sound of the buggy and horses faded into the distance. Lila let out a sob and sagged against the stove. Della looked at Jonah. He knows she is lying, and he knows you are protecting her." "Yes," Jonah said. "Why?" Della asked. "Why put your neck in a noose for a stranger?" Jonah looked at Lila. She was trembling, but she had already picked up the matches. She was striking one to light the fire. She was terrified, but she was doing the work. Jonah thought of the red seal in the bag. He thought of the land the government was trying to steal. He thought of the people who would be pushed into the dust if those papers disappeared. And he thought of the way she had held on to that pot. "She works here," Jonah said again. It was not just a statement of employment. It was a declaration of territory. He walked over to the back door and looked out at the empty horizon where the dust from Crow's buggy was still settling. The line had been drawn. Silas Crow would be back. He would come for the ledger. He would come for the girl. Jonah touched the brim of his hat. He had spent 5 years running from his past, trying to be nothing, trying to be no one. But today, he had drawn a line in the dirt. "Get the fire hot, Sarah," Jonah said, using her false name but looking her in the eye with a truth that stripped the lie away. "We are going to need the heat." Lila struck the match. The flame flared up, small and blue. She touched it to the kindling. For the first time in years, the stove at Boone's trading post began to warm. But as the fire caught, the wind outside screamed, bringing with it the promise of a long, hard winter. Jonah turned and walked out to the yard to check his rifle. The game had begun. The kitchen of Boone's trading post underwent a transformation that was less about renovation and more about exorcism. For 3 days, Lila Hart waged war against 2 years of accumulated neglect. She scrubbed the floorboards with lye soap and boiling water until the wood turned from a sullen gray to a pale, scrubbed pine. She attacked the cast-iron stove with wire wool and grease, scouring away the rust until the black metal gleamed with a dull, satin sheen. She worked with a ferocity that frightened Red Keen. The cowhand would come in for coffee and find her on her knees, her hair tied back in a ruthless knot, attacking a corner of the room as if the dust there had personally offended her ancestors. "She scrubs like she is trying to erase the floor," Red whispered to Eli one morning by the corral. "She is not erasing the floor," Eli said, watching the smoke curl from the chimney for the first time in forever. "She is making a place." By the fourth evening, the change was not just visible, it was olfactory. The trading post, which had smelled of stale tobacco and dry earth for as long as anyone could remember, now smelled of rendering lard, heating metal, and the earthy, sweet aroma of beans simmering with salt pork. Lila stood by the stove. Her dress was still the same gray wool, washed and mended but threadbare. Yet she wore a white apron Della had found in a trunk. It was too big for her, but she tied the strings tight around her waist. She lifted the lid of the Dutch oven, her own pot, the one she had carried across the desert. Inside, cornbread was rising, golden and cracked on top like the desert floor after a flash flood. Dinner that night was a revelation. It was simple food. Pinto beans stewed until they were creamy, flavored with the last of the salt pork and a handful of dried chilies she had found hanging in the pantry. The cornbread was dense and hot, slathered with the butter churned from the morning's milk. They ate at the long wooden table. Della sat at the head, Red and Eli on one side, Jonah and Lila on the other. Red Keen usually talked through his meals, a constant stream of complaints and tall tales. But tonight, he was silent. He ate with a focus that bordered on religion. He wiped his plate with a piece of cornbread, catching every drop of the bean juice. "I have eaten steak in Denver that did not taste this good," Red said finally, leaning back and patting his stomach. "Miss Sarah, you are a wizard." Lila did not look up. She kept her eyes on her plate. "It is just beans, Mr. Keen." "It is not just beans," Della said. She looked at Lila with a new appraisal. "It is hot, and it is on time. That counts for a lot out here." Jonah Gray had not spoken a word. He ate methodically, his movements precise. He held his spoon differently than the others, with a certain grace that belied his rough hands. When he finished, he did not scrape the plate or toss his utensil down. He placed the spoon gently on the side of the ceramic dish. It made no sound. He looked at the stove. The fire was dying down, casting a warm, orange glow across the room. The iron radiated heat, pushing back the chill of the high desert night. "Good bread," Jonah said. 2 words. But in the economy of Jonah Gray, 2 words were a speech. Lila looked at him then. For a second, their eyes met across the table. His gaze was dark, unreadable, but there was no pity in it. There was only acknowledgement. He knew what it cost to make a fire in a cold place. After the meal, Red and Eli went out to check the stock. Della retired to her room to wrestle with the accounts. Lila stayed in the kitchen to clean. She was scraping the last of the crust from the Dutch oven when the back door opened. Jonah stepped in from the porch. The night wind followed him, smelling of sage and cooling stone. He walked to the water barrel and dipped the ladle. He drank, then turned to watch her. "You work hard," he said. "Idleness gives a person time to think." Lila replied, not stopping her scrubbing. "I do not like to think. Thinking is how you stay alive," Jonah said. He moved closer, leaning his hip against the heavy work table. "But out here, thinking is not enough. You need to know the rules." Lila stopped. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him. The heat of the stove was at her back. "I know the rules. Keep your head down. Do not ask questions." "Those are town rules," Jonah corrected. "Those are rules for people with walls. Out here, the walls are thin. Rule number 1 is, you listen." He pointed a gloved finger toward the window. Tell me what you hear." Lila frowned. She tilted her head. "The wind, the windmill creaking." "Look deeper," Jonah said softly. Lila closed her eyes. She strained her ears against the silence. "I hear horses chewing." "How many?" "I do not know. A few." "4," Jonah said. "The roan is favoring her left hind leg. She shifts her weight every 3 breaths. You can hear the drag of the hoof in the dirt. And there is a coyote about a mile east, moving along the arroyo. You can hear the silence he creates. The crickets stop before he gets there." Lila opened her eyes. She looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. "You hear all that?" "You will too," Jonah said. "If you want to stay, rule number 2, you never go past the fence line without a rifle or a horse. The land looks flat, but it is full of cuts. A man or a woman can disappear in a ravine 10 yards from the house and never be found. I have no intention of leaving the house. Mr. Gray." "Jonah," he said. "And rule number 3, if you see dust, you get inside. If it is white dust, it is wind. If it is brown dust, it is animals. If it is red dust, it is men, and men are the only thing you need to worry about." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Why are you telling me this?" Jonah looked at the scar on his hand. He rubbed it absent-mindedly with his thumb. "Because Silas Crow will come back. And when he does, I might be fixing a fence 5 miles away. You need to know when to lock the door." Lila turned back to the pot. She picked up a cloth and began to dry it. "I used to work at an inn," she said quietly. "In Santa Fe. It was a respectable place. Clean sheets, good food." She paused. Jonah did not interrupt. He waited, motionless as the timber beams above them. "One night," Lila continued, her voice low, "I went to the cellar to get a jar of peaches. I heard voices, men discussing a contract. They were not talking about peaches. They were talking about burning a settlement to clear the title." She stopped. Her hands were gripping the iron rim of the pot so hard her knuckles were white. "I made a noise," she whispered. "Just a small noise. But they heard. I ran. I've been running for 3 weeks." She did not mention the ledger. She did not mention the map. She kept the core of the secret wrapped tight, but she gave him the edge of the truth. Jonah watched her back. He saw the tension in her shoulders. He wanted to tell her that running was a circle, that eventually you ran right back to where you started, but he said nothing. He just nodded. "Keep the door locked, Sarah," he said, using her false name, "and keep the water bucket full." He turned and left, disappearing into the dark. 2 days later, the reality of the territory arrived in the form of a freight wagon bound for Silver City. The driver was a man named Skinner, a heavy-set individual with a beard that looked like a bird's nest and eyes that roamed too freely. He had 2 guards with him, men who wore their guns low and their morals lower. They stopped for water and a meal. Lila was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening biscuits. Skinner walked into the main room, dusting the grit from his coat. He saw Della and nodded, but then his eyes caught movement through the open kitchen door. He saw Lila. He whistled. A low, sharp sound. "Well now," Skinner boomed. "Della, you did not tell me you upgraded the scenery. Since when do you keep a filly like that in the stable?" Lila froze. She held her back to him, her hands deep in the flour. One of the guards laughed. "Hey, girl, turn around. Let us see if the face matches the figure." Lila did not turn. She focused on the dough, folding it, pushing it, folding it. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was what she feared. Not the wind, not the coyotes, but this. The casual ownership men felt they could assert over any woman without a ring or a father standing next to her. "She is the cook, Skinner," Della said, her voice sharp. "And she is busy. You want beans, you sit, you want to stare. You can go stare at the mules." Skinner chuckled and walked toward the kitchen door. "Just being friendly. Della, a man gets lonely on the trail. Just want to see a pretty smile." He stepped into the kitchen. The air suddenly felt very small. "Turn around, darlin'," Skinner said, reaching out a hand to touch her shoulder. Lila spun, grabbing the rolling pin from the table. She held it like a club, her eyes wide and wild. "Do not touch me," she hissed. Skinner laughed. "Feisty. I like feisty." He took another step. The back door slammed open. It was not a loud slam, but the force of it vibrated through the floorboards. Jonah Gray stood there. He was covered in dust from the corral. He held a bridle in one hand. He did not look at Lila. He looked at Skinner. He did not shout. He did not draw his gun. He simply stood there, occupying the space with a density that sucked the air out of the room. He looked at Skinner with eyes that were flat and dead. The eyes of a man who had seen things Skinner could only have nightmares about. "The meal is 50 cents, Jonah said. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried across the room like a razor blade. "Eat it in the main room, or eat dust outside." Skinner stopped. He looked at Jonah. He looked at the scar on Jonah's hand, then up to the cold, dark eyes under the hat brim. Skinner was a bully, but he was also a survivor. He recognized a predator when he saw one. "Just having some fun. Cowboy," Skinner muttered, backing away. "No need to get riled." "I'm not riled," Jonah said. "I'm working, and so is she. Get out of her kitchen." Skinner retreated. He went back to the main room, muttering to his guards. They ate their beans in silence and left within the hour. When the wagon rolled away, Lila let out a long breath and leaned against the table. Her hands were shaking. Jonah walked over to the water bucket. He washed his hands, scrubbing the horse grit from his knuckles. "Thank you," Lila said softly. Jonah did not look at her. "Do not thank me. They are just men. Men are like dogs. They bark until they see a bigger dog." "I thought—" Lila hesitated. "I thought you might let them, to avoid trouble." Jonah dried his hands on a rag. He turned to her then. "I do not sell people, Sarah, and I do not let guests be insulted in my house." "Your house?" she asked. "I live here," he said. "That makes it mine enough to defend." He walked out, back to the horses. Lila watched him go. She felt a strange twisting in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but also fear. Every time he stood up for her, the target on his back got bigger, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that every man had a price. Silas Crow had money. The government had land. What did Jonah Gray have? A hat and a scar? How long before the price was right? 3 days later. Deputy Silas Crow returned. He did not come with a posse this time. He came alone, driving his buggy with a casual slowness that was more threatening than speed. He tied his horse to the rail and walked up the steps, carrying a leather portfolio. He entered the trading post like he owned the air inside it. He nodded to Della, then walked straight to the kitchen door. It was late afternoon. Lila was peeling potatoes. The fire in the stove was banking, a steady, warm heat that filled the room. The smell of rosemary and roasting chicken hung in the air. Red had shot 2 prairie chickens that morning. Crow stopped in the doorway. He sniffed. His nose wrinkled. "Domestic," Crow said, the word dripping with disdain. "It smells like a grandmother's parlor in here." Lila did not stand up. She kept the knife moving, a long ribbon of potato skin falling into the bucket. "Can I help you, Deputy?" Crow walked in. He placed the portfolio on the table, right next to the flour bin. "Just checking licenses. Sarah, County Ordinance. All businesses operating a public kitchen need a health and sanitation permit. New rule." "Since when?" Della asked from the doorway. Her arms crossed. "Since this morning," Crow said, smiling at her. "Civilization is coming. Della, we have to have standards." He looked around the kitchen. He saw the scrubbed floors. He saw the polished stove. He saw the jar of wildflowers Lila had placed on the windowsill, a small, defiant act of beauty. "You have made yourself quite at home," Crow said to Lila. "Cozy, warm." He hated it. Lila could see it in his eyes. Men like Crow thrived on chaos, on desperation. A warm kitchen, a clean floor. These were signs of order. Order he did not control. "I do my job," Lila said. Crow walked over to the stove. He reached out and touched the handle of the Dutch oven hanging on a hook Lila had hammered into the wall. "Heavy pot," Crow murmured. "Good for cooking. good for other things, hiding things. Maybe. Lila's grip on the knife tightened. It is for bread, deputy. Crow turned to her. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. You know, Sarah. I checked the records in Santa Fe. There is no Sarah Miller listed as working at any inn. Funny, that. I was paid under the table, Lila said, not blinking. It happens. It does, Crow agreed. Lots of things happen in the dark, but the sun always comes up, and when it does, the shadows disappear. He straightened up and tapped the portfolio. I will need to see your employment papers, Sarah, and your identification. By next week, or I will have to shut this kitchen down. He picked up his portfolio and walked to the door. He stopped next to Jonah, who had appeared on the porch, silent as a ghost. She is a good cook. Gray, Crow said. Shame if she had to leave. She is not leaving, Jonah said. Crow chuckled. Everyone leaves eventually. Jonah, even you, especially you. How is the hand still ache when it rains? Jonah did not answer. He just watched Crow climb into his buggy and drive away. That night, the tension in the trading post was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lila finished cleaning the kitchen in silence. She took the Dutch oven down from the hook. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight. It was iron. It was forged in fire. It did not break. She walked over to the wall next to the stove. There was a sturdy iron nail there. She hung the pot. It hung there like a shield, black and round. It is a weapon, she thought. If he comes back in the dark, it is a weapon. She went out to the porch. Jonah was sitting on the bench, whittling a piece of cedar. He knows, Lila said. He knows I am lying. He suspects, Jonah corrected. Knowing requires proof. He will manufacture proof, Lila said bitterly. He is the law. He is a deputy. Jonah said, there is a difference. Lila looked at him. Why are you doing this? You know I am trouble. You know I could bring this whole place down. Jonah stopped whittling. He looked out at the dark plains. My people, he began, his voice low. We believe that when you save a life, you take responsibility for it. I picked you up off the dirt. Sarah, I am not going to throw you back into it. My name is Lila, she whispered. It was a risk, a massive risk. She was giving him the handle to the weapon that could destroy her. Jonah did not turn. He carved a long curl of wood from the stick. Lila, he tested the name. It suits you better than Sarah. Lila Hart, she said. Well, Lila Hart, Jonah said. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is baking day. She went inside, her heart beating with a strange, terrified hope. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that there were men who did not have a price. But the ledger in her bag upstairs whispered otherwise. It whispered that land was worth more than blood, and gold was worth more than honor. Jonah stayed on the porch. He watched the stars. He felt the old ache in his hand, the phantom pain of the life he had lost. He was getting involved. He was putting Della and Eli and the ranch in the crosshairs of a man like Crow. For what, he asked himself? For a pot of beans? For a pair of scared eyes? No. It was for the fire, for the way the kitchen felt when he walked in. For the first time in 5 years, he did not feel cold. The door to the barn creaked. Eli came running toward the house, his breath coming in short gasps. Jonah! The boy hissed. Jonah was on his feet instantly, the knife folded and pocketed. What is it? Eli pointed toward the north ridge, away from the road, away from where Crow had gone. I was checking the trap line, Eli said, his voice trembling. By the dry creek, I saw tracks. Coyotes. No, Eli said, his eyes wide in the moonlight. Horses, shod horses, and wheel tracks. A wagon. But not on the road. They were hidden in the arroyo. Someone is parked out there. Jonah. Someone is watching the house. Jonah looked toward the north ridge. It was a black shape against the stars. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Crow was not just checking licenses. He was setting a perimeter. He was tightening the noose. Go inside, Eli, Jonah said quietly. Tell no one. What are you going to do? Jonah touched the brim of his hat. I am going to listen. He walked down the steps and into the dark, moving toward the north, toward the silence that was not empty. The kitchen was warm, but the night was getting colder by the second, and somewhere out there, the red dust was waiting to rise. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. When the rider galloped into the yard, his horse was lathered in white foam, its sides heaving like bellows. Jonah Gray was by the trough, washing the dust from his neck. He did not look surprised. He had felt the vibration of the hooves in the ground long before the rider appeared on the ridge. The man slid from the saddle, stumbling. It was Mr. Abernathy, a freighter who usually ran the route to Silver City. "Bandits!" Abernathy gasped, clutching his side. 3 miles east, at the Arroyo Seco crossing. They hit the mail wagon. The driver is down. Passengers, pinned down. Della Boone stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was set in stone. In this territory, there was no sheriff within a day's ride. The law was what you made of it. Charity was a difficult requirement for survival. "Jonah," Della said. She did not need to issue an order. Jonah was already moving. He grabbed his saddle from the rail. "Red, Eli, mount up." Red Keene dropped the bucket he was holding, his eyes lighting up with the prospect of a fight. "I will get the Winchester. Get the medical kit too," Jonah commanded. "And water." He tightened the cinch on his black mare. Lila appeared at the kitchen door, her face pale. She watched Jonah check the cylinder of his revolver. Jonah walked over to her. He loomed tall in the dying light, his shadow stretching across the porch. "Lock the door," he said. His voice was low, meant only for her. "Bar it with the oak plank. Do not open it for anyone but me or Della." "You are leaving," Lila said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fear. "I will be back," Jonah said. "Watch the horizon. If you see red dust, you hide in the cellar." He swung into the saddle. With a sharp whistle to Red and Eli, the 3 men thundered out of the yard, disappearing into the haze of the twilight. The silence that followed was heavy. Della went to tend to Mr. Abernathy, taking him into the main bunk room to bind his ribs. Lila was alone in the kitchen. She did exactly as Jonah said. She slammed the heavy oak door and dropped the thick wooden bar into place. Then she went to the window and closed the shutters, leaving only a sliver of space to watch the yard. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the glow of the embers in the stove. Lila felt the weight of the house pressing in on her. She felt the eyes of the night staring at the walls. She went to the loose floorboard under the pantry shelf. Her fingers trembled as she pried it up. She pulled out the canvas bag. For days, she had been too terrified to look at it closely. She had carried it like a curse. But now, with Jonah gone and the threat of Silas Crow hanging over them like a guillotine blade, she needed to know. She needed to know exactly what she was dying for. She carried the bag to the table and lit a small oil lamp. Turning the wick down low, she pulled out the ledger. It was heavy, bound in black leather that smelled of expensive cigars. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and dates, written in a cramped, meticulous hand. Lila could read well enough. Her father had been a schoolteacher before the whiskey took him, and what she saw made her stomach turn. April 4th, surveying fees. North Valley. Recipient S. Crow, $50. May 12th, information regarding water rights. Recipient S. Crow, $75. June 1st, relocation facilitation. Recipient Deputy S. Crow, $100. It went on and on. It was not just a record of payments. It was a map of corruption. It showed how Silas Crow was systematically declaring land uninhabited or hostile so it could be seized and sold to the railroad companies. He was selling the ground out from under families, out from under the indigenous tribes, and pocketing the blood money. And then, tucked in the back, she found the loose page. It was a list of names. Some were crossed out. Miller, evicted. Henderson, accident. Gray, watch. Lila's breath hitched. Jonah's name was there. Gray. She slammed the book shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. They were not just hunting her because she'd seen a crime. They were hunting her because she held the proof that could hang the deputy of the territory. Clack! The sound came from the back door. It was soft, the sound of metal testing wood. Lila froze. She blew out the lamp instantly. The kitchen plunged into darkness, save for the red eye of the stove. Clack, thump! Someone was trying the latch. "Open up," a voice whispered. It was not Jonah. It was a rough, gravelly voice. "We know you are in there, girl." Lila did not answer. She backed away from the table, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. She moved toward the stove. The wooden bar held, but then came the sound of splintering wood. They were using a pry bar. Lila looked around frantically for a weapon. She had the butcher knife, but it was on the table, too close to the door. Her hand brushed the warm metal of the Dutch oven sitting on the side shelf. She had used it to roast potatoes earlier. It was still hot, but bearable. But inside was the ash box she had just emptied from the firebox. The door groaned. A crack of moonlight appeared as the wood gave way. Lila grabbed the heavy iron handle of the ash bucket with one hand and the lid of the Dutch oven with the other. The door burst open. 2 men spilled into the room. They were silhouettes against the night sky, big and smelling of sweat and horse leather. They wore dusters and bandanas over their faces. "Grab her!" the first man growled. He lunged forward, reaching for Lila. Lila did not scream. She stepped into the movement, swinging the bucket of hot ash with all the strength in her desperate body. "Eat this," she hissed. The cloud of gray. Scorching ash exploded in the man's face. He howled, clawing at his eyes, blinding himself in a cloud of grit and heat. He stumbled back, crashing into the table. The second man drew a knife. He stepped over his partner, cursing. "You little witch!" Lila swung the heavy cast-iron lid like a discus. It connected with the man's wrist with a sickening crack. He dropped the knife, yelling in pain. Lila turned and ran. She bolted through the door into the main room, past a startled Della who was coming out with a shotgun, and out the front door. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away from the house, away from the ledger, if she could draw them off. Maybe Della would be safe. She ran toward the stables. The horses, if she could get a horse. She heard boots pounding the dirt behind her. The second man, the one with the broken wrist, was fast. "Get back here," he screamed. Lila reached the stable door. She fumbled with the latch. Her fingers were slippery with sweat. She got it open and slipped inside, into the smell of hay and manure. She scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, diving into the straw just as the man burst through the stable doors. "I see you," he panted. He began to climb the ladder. Lila huddled in the dark, clutching a pitchfork she had found in the straw. She was trapped. Then she heard it, the sound of a horse stopping. Not arriving, but stopping. The transition from a gallop to a standstill in one fluid motion. The stable door creaked. The man on the ladder froze. "Who is there?" the man demanded, turning his head. "Step down," a voice said. It was calm. It was cold. It was the voice of winter itself. Jonah Gray. The man on the ladder laughed nervously. "Walk away, cowboy. This does not concern you." "You are in my barn," Jonah said. "You are scaring my horses. That concerns me." The man pulled a second pistol from his belt with his good hand and spun around, firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flash lit up the stable for a split second. In that flash, Lila saw Jonah. He was not standing where the man aimed. He had moved. He was a shadow detaching itself from the wall. Jonah did not fire. He stepped forward and swung his rifle barrel. It connected with the man's knee. The man screamed and fell from the ladder, hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud. Before the man could recover, Jonah was on him. He kicked the gun away and placed the heel of his boot on the man's throat. "Stay," Jonah said. Outside, the first man, the one blinded by ash, was stumbling across the yard, rubbing his eyes and shouting. Red Keen and Eli appeared from the darkness, their guns drawn. They had circled back. "Got this one. Jonah." Red shouted, tackling the blinded man to the ground. It was over in seconds. No prolonged gunfight, no glorious duel, just brutal, efficient discipline. Lila peered over the edge of the loft. Jonah looked up. In the sliver of moonlight coming through the slats, his face was unreadable. "Come down, Sarah," he said softly. Lila climbed down the ladder. Her legs were shaking so hard she almost fell. When her feet hit the ground, she stumbled. Jonah caught her. His hands were firm on her arms. He did not hug her, but he held her upright. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she whispered. "Just ash." He looked at her hands, still black with soot. He looked at the pitchfork she had dropped. "You fought," he said. There was a note of respect in his voice. "I had to," she said. Suddenly, the sound of slow clapping echoed from the doorway. Lila spun around. Jonah pushed her behind him, his hand dropping to his revolver. Deputy Silas Crow stood in the entrance of the stable, holding a lantern. He looked immaculate, his suit free of dust. "Bravo," Crow said. "Quite a show. I heard a commotion from the road. I figured I should investigate." He walked in, looking at the two men groaning on the ground. My, Crow said. "It looks like you have assaulted 2 citizens, Mr. Gray." "They broke into my house," Jonah said. "They attacked my employee?" Crow tutted. "Did they? Or did they come looking for stolen property? These men, I believe they work for the surveying company. Maybe they were just looking for their lost documents." "They were wearing masks," Jonah said. "Surveyors do not wear masks." Crow smiled. "Maybe they were cold. The nights are chilly." He looked at Lila, peering over Jonah's shoulder. "You are causing a lot of trouble, Sarah." Crow said, "Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. Jonah, even for a war hero." Jonah stepped forward. "She is not a fugitive, and these men are trespassing. Take them and get off my land." Crow's smile faded. His eyes went hard. "Your land. We will see about that. The new maps are very interesting. Jonah, they show some discrepancies in the deed lines." He signaled to the darkness outside. 2 more deputies appeared. "Get these men to the doctor," Crow ordered. He turned back to Jonah. "This is a warning. Gray, you're playing a dangerous game, and you're playing it with a bad hand." Crow turned and walked out. When they were gone, the silence returned, but it was shattered, fragile. Jonah turned to Lila. They were alone in the stable. The horses shifted in their stalls. Sensing the tension, "The ledger," Jonah said. Lila looked down. "I saw it. I saw your name." Jonah stiffened. "My name. He is watching you," Lila said. "He is paid to clear the valley. He marks people for accidents. And I saw the entries. He is stealing the land. All of it." She looked up at him, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "I am sorry. I brought this to you. I should have kept running." Jonah walked over to a workbench. He picked up a heavy iron bar and a hammer. He walked to the stable door and began to hammer a new bracket into the frame. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was rhythmic, angry. "I was a scout," Jonah said between strikes. He did not look at her. "For the army, 10 years ago. They told me they wanted to make peace treaties. They needed someone who spoke the language, someone who knew the trails." He hit the nail hard. "I believed them," he said. "I drew the maps. I led them to the winter camps. I thought I was saving my mother's people. I thought I was bringing blankets and food." He stopped hammering. He rested his forehead against the rough wood of the door. "They brought cavalry," he whispered. "They used my maps to corner them, to kill them." He turned to look at Lila. His eyes were full of pain so old it had turned to stone. "I hate paper," Jonah said. "I hate maps. And I hate promises. They are all lies." Lila walked toward him. She stopped a foot away. "The ledger is not a lie. Jonah, it is the truth. It is the only truth that can stop him." "It is just paper," Jonah said bitterly. "Fire burns paper. Guns tear paper. Not this paper," Lila said. "This paper has a seal. If we get it to Santa Fe, to a judge who has not bought it." Jonah looked at her. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes. She was a cook who threw ash at gunmen. She was a woman who carried a cast-iron pot across a desert. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, rusted horseshoe. He held it up. "Give me the hammer," he said. Lila handed it to him. Jonah nailed the horseshoe above the stable door, the open end facing up. "To catch the luck," he said, "and to keep the devils out." He looked at her. "You are not leaving, Lila. Not tonight, not tomorrow." "He will come back with a warrant," Lila said. "Let him come." Jonah said, "We will be ready." He checked the lock he had just reinforced. It was solid. "You said you saw my name," Jonah said quietly. "Yes." "Gray, watch." Jonah nodded. "Then he knows I am a threat. That is good. It means he is afraid." He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of ash from her cheek. His thumb was rough, calloused, but his touch was light. "You fought well," he said. "I was scared," she admitted. "Fear keeps you sharp." Jonah said, "Courage is just fear that has said its prayers." They walked back to the house together. Jonah walked on her left side, placing his body between her and the road. It was a small gesture, a silent vow of protection. Inside the kitchen, Della was waiting. She had the shotgun on the table and a pot of coffee boiling. "They are gone?" Della asked. "For now," Jonah said. "Red says they are spreading talk in town," Della said, pouring a cup. "He heard it at the saloon before we left. Silas is telling people you are meeting with Apache renegades. He says you are planning a raid on the settlement." Jonah took the cup. He blew on the steam. "He wants to isolate us," Jonah said. "He wants the town to look the other way when he burns us out." "It will work," Della said grimly. "People are scared. They will believe anything that gives them a villain." Jonah looked at Lila, who was washing the ash from her hands in the basin. "Let them talk," Jonah said. "Words are wind. We have the iron." He looked at the Dutch oven hanging on the wall, then at the rifle leaning against the door. "We take shifts tonight," Jonah ordered. "Red, you take the roof. Eli, the barn. I will take the porch." "And me?" Lila asked. Jonah looked at her. "You keep that fire burning. If we lose the fire, we lose everything." Lila nodded. She understood. The fire was the heart. It was the reason they were fighting. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling across the plains. But inside the kitchen, the lock was solid. The stove was warm. And, for the first time, Lila Hart did not feel like she was running. She felt like she was standing her ground. But in the dark of the night, miles away in the town of Sweetwater, Silas Crow was sitting in his office, pouring a glass of brandy. He smiled as he looked at the map on his wall. He took a red pen and drew a circle around Boone's trading post. "Burn it," he whispered to the empty room. "Burn it all." The air inside Boone's trading post had changed. It no longer smelled just of old wood and dry sage. It smelled of gunpowder and waiting. The silence that stretched between the walls was tight, pulled taut like a bowstring just before the arrow flew. Jonah Gray stood by the window in the main room, watching the heat waves dance off the hard pan. It was noon, 2 days after the attack in the barn. The dust had settled, but the feeling of being watched had not. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a boot step. "We cannot stay here," Jonah said. Not turning around, Della Boone was counting tins of coffee behind the counter, her hands moving with a mechanical rhythm. She stopped. "This is my home. Jonah, I do not run from my home." "I am not asking you to run," Jonah said. He turned to face her. "I am asking you to let me take the target away from the house. Silas does not want the beans. Della, he wants the book. And he wants the girl." Lila was sitting at the table, mending a tear in her skirt. She stopped sewing, the needle hovering over the gray wool. She looked at Jonah. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were etched deeper than she had ever seen them. He had not slept more than 2 hours a night since the attack, patrolling the perimeter like a wolf guarding a den. "Where?" Lila asked. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "There is a circuit judge coming down from Santa Fe," Jonah said. "Judge Thaddeus Moore. He is an honest man. He rides the Southern Loop once a season. He is due at the old San Miguel Mission ruins by tomorrow evening. If we can get the ledger to him. He has the power to issue a federal warrant. Silas cannot touch a federal warrant." "The ruins are 20 miles through the Badlands," Della said, her face pale. "Through the canyons, ideally suited for an ambush." "That is why we leave tonight," Jonah said. "Under the moon. We take the high trails, the goat paths. Silas expects a wagon on the road. We will give him empty air." He looked at Lila. "Pack light, water, the ledger, and boots you can run in." The afternoon passed in a blur of quiet, frantic preparation. They did not light the stove. Smoke would be a signal. They ate cold cornbread and dried beef. As the sun began to bleed into the western horizon, turning the sky a violent shade of bruised plum, Jonah went to the small tack room off the kitchen to clean his weapons. Lila found him there. He was sitting on a crate, a rag in one hand and his Colt revolver in the other. The smell of gun oil was sharp and metallic. She stood in the doorway, watching him. He worked with a reverence that was almost religious. He disassembled the cylinder, wiping each chamber, checking the springs. He was not just cleaning a tool. He was preparing for a ceremony of violence. He looked up and saw her. He did not speak, just nodded, acknowledging her presence, then went back to the metal. Lila stepped into the room. It was intimate, enclosed. The walls hung with bridles and stirrups. "You think we will not make it?" Lila said softly. Jonah paused. He slid the cylinder back into the frame with a solid click. "I think the odds are long, but I have played long odds before." "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You could ride north. You could be in Colorado in 3 days. Safe." Jonah began to load the rounds. 1, 2, 3. "A man who runs from the truth is not safe," Jonah said. "He is just tired. I am done being tired." He holstered the gun and picked up his rifle. He began to wipe down the barrel. Lila watched his hands. They were strong hands, scarred and weathered. Hands that had known hard work and harder fights. But she had seen them be gentle, too. She had seen him lift a pot as if it were glass. She had seen him brush ash from her cheek. She felt a sudden, crushing weight in her chest. It was the weight of all the things she had never done, all the life she had postponed while she was busy surviving. She looked at this man, this stoic, broken warrior who was willing to bleed for her, and she felt a terrifying clarity. "Jonah," she said. He stopped cleaning the rifle. He looked up. The light in the room was dimming, shadows pooling in the corners. "I have been running since I was 16, Lila said. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "First from my father's debts, then from the inn, then from Silas. I have spent my whole life looking over my shoulder." She moved a step closer to him. The space between them felt charged, electric. "I have never stopped long enough to just be—" She swallowed hard. "I have never been kissed, Jonah." Jonah went very still. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the context of the danger and the dust. He saw the woman beneath the fear. He saw the softness she tried so hard to hide behind the iron pot and the gray wool. She rushed to explain, fearing he might misunderstand. "I do not say that I am not asking for charity, and I am not trying to be something I am not. But if we go out there tonight, if the dark takes us—" She trailed off. She did not want to say if we would die, but the words hung there anyway. She wanted to know, just once, what it was like to be held not to be saved, but to be cherished. She wanted to know that her body was her own, and that she could choose who touched it. Jonah stood up. He was tall, filling the small room. He placed the rifle gently against the wall. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not smile. This was not a joke to him. He understood exactly what she was offering, and exactly what she was asking. It was a trust deeper than the one she had placed in him with the ledger. Slowly, deliberately, Jonah reached up and took off his hat. It was a gesture she had seen him do 100 times, usually when entering the house or speaking to Della. But this was different. He was not just uncovering his head, he was disarming. He was taking off the symbol of the cowboy, the scout, the protector. He was laying down the role he played for the world. He placed the hat on the crate beside him. His dark hair was flattened slightly by the brim, his face open and vulnerable in the twilight. He stepped closer. He did not touch her yet. He left a foot of air between them, a space for her to retreat if she wanted to. "Then let me make it sacred," Jonah whispered. The words washed over her like warm water. Sacred. Not dirty, not stolen, not a transaction. He raised his hands slowly, giving her time to see them coming. He cupped her face. His palms were rough, the leather of his gloves removed, his skin warm and dry against her cheeks. His thumbs brushed her jawline, a touch so light it shivered through her bones. Lila looked up into his eyes. They were dark pools of ancient sorrow. But right now, there was a light in them that was only for her. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. She could not speak. He leaned down. He did not rush. He closed the distance by inches, letting her feel the heat of his body, the scent of him soap, tobacco, and the clean smell of the wind. When his lips touched hers, it was not the crashing of waves. It was the settling of the earth. It was soft, unbelievably soft. Lila's eyes fluttered shut. She had expected it to be frightening or overwhelming. She had expected to feel trapped, but she felt found. His mouth moved against hers with a gentle, questioning pressure. He was tasting the silence of her life and filling it with a promise. "I am here. You are here. We are safe in this inch of space." She let out a small, broken sound, a whimper of release, and leaned into him. Her hands came up to clutch the front of his shirt. She felt the solid wall of his chest, the steady, heavy beat of his heart. Jonah deepened the kiss. Just a fraction. He tilted his head, his hands sliding into her hair, cradling the back of her skull as if she were made of porcelain. He kissed the fear out of her. He kissed away the memory of the cold nights and the hungry days. For a long moment, there was no Silas Crow. There was no ledger. There was no gun on the crate. There was only the warmth of his mouth and the sanctuary of his arms. It was a baptism of fire, but a fire that warmed without burning. He pulled back slowly, resting his forehead against hers. His breathing was ragged. Lila kept her eyes closed, trying to memorize the feeling of his breath on her skin. "Lila," he whispered. It was the first time he had said her name with that kind of tenderness. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her with a fierce possessiveness, not the possessiveness of ownership, but of guardianship. "You belong to yourself," Jonah said, low and rough. "Always remember that. What you give is yours to give. No one takes it." "I know," she whispered. "Now I know." He brushed his thumb across her lower lip, catching a tear that had fallen there. "Get your bag," he said, his voice returning to the steel of the scout, though his eyes remained soft. "The moon is rising." Lila stepped back. She felt steady. She felt like she had armor under her skin. She picked up her canvas bag. Jonah put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. The warrior was back, but the man was still there, just beneath the shadow. They walked out of the tack room and into the kitchen. Della was there, extinguishing the last lamp. "Red and Eli are saddling the horses. The pack mule is ready." Jonah nodded. "We go out the back, through the dry wash. We keep the ridge between us and the road until we hit the canyon." He opened the back door. The night air rushed in, cool and crisp. And then, the world shattered. Boom! A gunshot echoed from the front of the trading post. Not a warning shot. A hit. Glass shattered in the main room. "Get down!" Jonah roared, shoving Lila and Della to the floor. He rolled, bringing his rifle up in one fluid motion. Outside, the sound of galloping horses erupted, not from the road, but from everywhere. They were surrounded. "Light them up!" a voice screamed from the darkness. It was a voice Lila knew. Silas Crow. Torches flared to life at the front gate. 3 of them, then 4, then 6. The yard was suddenly bathed in flickering, hellish orange light. "Jonah!" Eli's voice screamed from the barn. It was a high, terrified shriek that cut through the noise like a knife. Jonah scrambled to the window, risking a look. The yard was full of men, deputies, hired guns, and in the center, near the water trough, Silas Crow sat on his black gelding. He held a torch in one hand, and on the other hand, he held a rope. The rope trailed behind his horse. At the end of the rope, dragged into the dust, his hands bound, was Eli. The boy was crying, his face muddied, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Come out, Gray," Silas bellowed. His face was twisted in a rictus of triumph. "Come out, or I will drag this boy until there is nothing left to bury." Jonah froze. His face went white, then cold. Absolute zero. He looked at the rifle in his hands. He could make the shot. He could drop Silas from here, but the men around Silas had their guns trained on the boy. If Jonah fired, Eli would be cut to ribbons before Silas hit the ground. Lila crawled to Jonah's side. She looked out. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He has Eli," she sobbed. "He wants me," Jonah said. His voice was dead. "He wants to trade." "He will kill you," Della hissed from the floor. "He will kill you both." Jonah looked at the back door. The path to the canyon was still open. The men were concentrated at the front. He could take Lila. He could run. He could save the ledger, save the witness, save the mission. That was the logical choice. That was the scout's choice. Sacrifice the few to save the many. But Jonah looked at Eli. He looked at the boy who had brushed horses with him, the boy who looked at him like he was a hero. He looked at Lila. "Take the ledger," Jonah said to Lila. He shoved the canvas bag into her hands. "What?" Lila stared at him. "There is a cut in the fence behind the smokehouse," Jonah said rapidly. "It leads to the arroyo. Follow the dry bed north. It connects to the canyon. Go now." "No," Lila said, grabbing his arm. "I am not leaving you. You have to," Jonah said. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. "That book is the only thing that stops him. If he gets it, Eli dies anyway. Della dies. We all die. You have to be the one to carry it." "Jonah, go," he snarled. He pushed her toward the back door. Then he turned to Della. "Cover her," Jonah said. "When I step out, they will look at me. That is your window." Della nodded. She gripped her shotgun, tears streaming down her iron face. "God go with you, Jonah Gray." Jonah stood up. He adjusted his hat. He checked his holster one last time. He walked to the front door. He unbarred it. Lila paused at the back door. She looked back one last time. She saw his silhouette against the torchlight coming through the cracks. He looked tall. He looked like the fence posts, like the mesas, like the land itself. "Let me make it sacred." She bit her lip until it bled. Then she slipped out into the darkness, clutching the bag to her chest. Jonah kicked the front door open. He stepped out onto the porch. He did not have his rifle raised. He held his hands out, away from his body, palms open. The yard went silent. The only sound was the crackle of the torches and Eli's sobbing. Silas Crow smiled. It was the smile of a wolf that had cornered a stag. "Reasonable man," Silas said. "I knew you were a reasonable man. Let the boy go. Silas," Jonah called out. His voice was steady, carrying over the wind. "He is not part of this. Everything is part of this," Silas said. He gave the rope a sharp tug. Eli cried out as he was pulled through the dirt. Jonah's hands curled into fists, then relaxed. "Discipline." "I am here," Jonah said. "You want the ledger. You want the girl come and talk to me." "Oh, I do not want to talk. Jonah," Silas said softly, "I want to watch you burn." He signaled to his men. "Check the house," Silas roared. "Find the girl and bring me the book." 2 men rushed the porch. Jonah stood his ground for a second, blocking the door. Then, from the darkness of the back lot, a shadow moved. A horse whinnied. Lila was running. She was in the arroyo. She was safe, but Red Keen was not. Red burst from the barn, firing 2 pistols wildly. Let him go! Let the boy go! It was brave. It was foolish. It was suicide. The deputies turned and opened fire. Red jerked as a bullet caught him in the shoulder. He spun, falling behind a water trough. Chaos erupted. Jonah used the distraction. He did not surrender. He drew his Colt with a speed that blurred the eye. Bang! Bang! The two men rushing the porch dropped, clutching their legs. Jonah dove off the porch, rolling into the dirt, coming up behind the rain barrel. "Kill him!" Silas screamed, his horse rearing. "Kill them all!" Bullets tore into the wood of the porch. The air was filled with lead and screaming. Jonah peered around the barrel. He saw Silas backing his horse away, dragging Eli with him into the shadows of the road. "Jonah!" Eli screamed. Jonah looked back. The arroyo was dark. Lila was gone. She had made it. Now, he just had to survive long enough to give her a lead. He looked at the canyon to the west. It was a maze of rock and shadow. If he could get there, if he could draw them into the broken ground, he stood a chance. He looked at Eli one last time. The boy was being hauled away into the dark. Jonah made a choice. He could not save Eli by dying on the porch. He had to hunt. He turned and sprinted, not toward the house, not toward Eli, but toward the paddock where his black mare was spooked but waiting. Bullets kicked up dust around his boots. He vaulted the fence, landing in the saddle. He cut the tether with his knife. "Yeah," the mare bolted. Jonah leaned low over her neck, riding straight through the back fence, shattering the wood. He rode for the canyon. Behind him, Silas Crow watched him go. He laughed. "Let him run," Silas shouted to his men. "He is leading us right to the rat hole. Bring the boy. We will use him to flush the scout out." Silas turned his horse and followed, the torch in his hand leaving a trail of smoke against the stars. Lila, running through the dry riverbed, heard the hoofbeats thundering away. She heard the laughter. She fell to her knees, clutching the ledger. She was alone in the dark, but her lips still tingled with the memory of the kiss. Sacred, she thought. He made it sacred. She stood up. She wiped the tears from her face. "I will not let you die, Jonah Gray," she whispered to the wind. She turned north, toward the mission ruins. She began to run. The heavy iron pot was left behind in the kitchen, but the fire it had started was burning in her chest now. She was no longer just a cook. She was the woman who held the truth, and she was going to deliver it, even if she had to walk through hell to do it. The night swallowed them all, the hunter, the hunted, and the boy dragged between them. The climax had begun. The canyon known as the Devil's Throat was not a place for the living. It was a jagged scar in the earth, a maze of sandstone pillars and blind corners where the wind screamed like a dying animal. It was here, in the suffocating dark of the moonless night, that Jonah Gray chose to make his stand. He had ridden his mare into a lather, leading Silas Crow's posse away from the open plains and into the choke point. Then he had slapped the horse's flank, sending her galloping on alone to draw their fire, while he scrambled up the scree slope to the high rocks. Now, he waited. Below him, the canyon floor was a theater of shadows. He could hear them coming, the clatter of shod hooves on stone, the curse of men who were used to flat roads and soft beds, and the sound that made his blood run cold, the weeping of a terrified boy. Torches flared, painting the canyon walls in flickering orange. Silas Crow rode into the clearing, his face illuminated by the firelight. He looked like a demon king surveying his underworld. He held the rope taut. At the end of it, Eli Boone stumbled, his knees raw, his face a mask of dust and tears. "I know you are here, Gray," Silas bellowed. His voice echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying into a chorus of threats. "I can smell the desperation." Jonah lay flat on a shelf of rock, 50 feet up. He had his Winchester rifle pressed against his shoulder. He breathed in, slow and deep. The air smelled of sage and impending violence. He had 5 rounds in the rifle, 6 in the Colt on his hip. There were 8 men below. "Come out!" Silas shouted. He jerked the rope, and Eli cried out, falling to the dirt. "Come out, or I will paint these rocks with the boy's blood." Jonah sighted down the barrel. He could take Silas. It was a clean shot, but the moment his finger tightened, the 7 other guns would turn on Eli. It was a stalemate written in flesh. Jonah stood up. He stepped to the edge of the overhang, silhouetted against the star-strewn sky. "Let him go, Silas," Jonah said. His voice was calm, carrying the weight of the stone around them. Silas looked up, shading his eyes against the torchlight. He smiled. "The scout returns. I thought you would be halfway to Mexico by now." "I do not leave on my own," Jonah said. "Is that so?" Silas laughed. "Then where's the girl? Where's the book?" "Safe," Jonah lied. "Gone." "I do not believe you," Silas said. He pulled a heavy dragoon pistol from his holster and pressed the cold barrel against Eli's temple. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, trembling violently. "I think she is close. I think you are just a distraction. Now, throw down your weapons, Jonah, or the boy dies, and then I will hunt her down at my leisure." Jonah looked at the gun. He looked at Eli. The old war screamed in his head the memories of massacres, of helpless people caught in the gears of power. Savage wanted to jump. Savage wanted to tear Silas apart with his bare hands, but the man stood still. "Do not do it! Jonah!" Eli screamed. "Quiet!" Silas struck the boy with the back of his hand. Jonah's grip on the rifle tightened until the wood creaked. He was trapped. If he surrendered, they all died. If he fought, Eli died. Then, a sound cut through the tension, the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Not from the rocks above, but from the canyon entrance. "Let him go! Silas!" The voice was shaking, but it was loud. Jonah froze. He looked down. Lila Hart walked into the circle of torchlight. She was covered in dust, her dress torn, her chest heaving from the run. She held the canvas bag high in the air with both hands. "Lila, no!" Jonah roared from the cliff. "Run!" She did not look up. She kept her eyes locked on Silas Crow. She looked small against the towering horses and the armed men, but she stood with a spine of steel. "You want the ledger?" Lila called out. "It is here. I have it." Silas stared at her. Greed washed over his face, replacing the cruelty for a split second. He lowered the gun from Eli's head. Well, Silas purred. "The cook has courage. Let the boy go," Lila said, stepping closer. "And let Jonah walk away. You get the book. You get the land. You win." "Lila, do not give it to him," Jonah shouted. "He will kill you anyway." "I know," Lila whispered to herself. But she kept walking. She stopped 10 feet from Silas's horse. She tossed the bag onto the ground. It landed with a heavy thud. Silas signaled to one of his men. "Check it!" A deputy dismounted and snatched up the bag. He ripped it open and pulled out the black leather book. He flipped through the pages. "It is the real thing, boss," the deputy said. "Seal is here. Your name is here." Silas threw his head back and laughed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. "You see, Jonah, everyone breaks. Everyone has a price." He looked at Lila. "You should have kept running. Darling, you really should have." Silas raised his pistol, aiming it square at Lila's chest. "Burn it," Silas ordered the deputy. "Burn it right here. Let them watch their hope turn to ash." The deputy pulled a match from his pocket. He struck it on his boot. He held the flame to the corner of the open ledger. The paper curled, blackening, then caught fire. Lila watched the flames lick at the pages. She did not flinch. "There," Silas said, grinning. "Now, kill them all. Start with the girl." The deputies raised their rifles. Crack! A gunshot rang out from the darkness of the opposing ridge. The deputy holding the burning book cried out as a bullet smashed into his shoulder. He dropped the ledger. "I would not be so smug." "Silas," a voice rang out. It was a woman's voice, hard as granite. Della Boone stood on the high ridge opposite Jonah, a buffalo rifle smoking in her hands. "That is just paper," Della shouted. Burn it to hell, I have the copy." Silas's head snapped up. "What?" "Lila copied it," Della yelled, her voice echoing through the canyon. "Last night by the stove, every date, every dollar, every acre you stole, and every pound of beef you took from the reservation rations, I have it right here." and I have Judge Moore waiting at the mission." The color drained from Silas's face. The ledger on the ground was burning. But it didn't matter. The secret was out. "You are lying," Silas screamed. "Am I?" Della called back. "Why do you think she came back to bait the trap, you son of a bitch?" Lila looked up at Jonah. Even in the dark, their eyes met. "Trust me," her look said. "I am not just a cook." "Kill them!" Silas shrieked, panic cracking his voice. "Kill them all! Don't let anyone leave this canyon!" The deputies turned their guns toward the ridges. Jonah did not hesitate. The moment of paralysis was gone. He was no longer a man trapped by a hostage. He was a hunter in his element. He raised his rifle and fired. Bang! The torch nearest to Silas exploded, showering the horses in sparks and hot oil. The animals panicked, rearing and bucking. "Get down!" Jonah shouted to Lila. Lila dove behind a boulder just as the canyon erupted in gunfire. Jonah moved. He did not stay in one place. He fired, worked the lever, ran along the ledge, and fired again. He did not shoot to kill. He shot hands. He shot legs. He shot rifles out of grips. He was a surgeon with a Winchester, dissecting the posse with terrifying precision. Below, in the chaos of dust and darkness, the deputies were firing blindly at the muzzle flashes. "Hold your fire! You are hitting the horses!" Silas screamed, struggling to control his mount. Jonah dropped the rifle. It was empty. He drew his Colt. He slid down the scree slope, moving like a landslide, boots surfing the loose rock. He hit the canyon floor and rolled, coming up in the shadow of a pillar. He was in the fight now. Close quarters. A deputy loomed out of the smoke, raising a shotgun. Jonah stepped inside the guard, deflected the barrel with his left forearm, and pistol-whipped the man across the jaw. The man crumbled. Another man turned. Jonah shot him in the thigh. The man went down, howling. Jonah scanned the chaos. "Eli, run to the rocks!" He saw the boy scrambling away on his hands and knees. Then he saw Silas. The deputy had abandoned his horse. He had grabbed Lila. He had her arm twisted behind her back, using her as a human shield, his pistol pressed to her neck. He was backing toward the narrow exit of the canyon. "Back off!" Silas screamed. "Back off or I blow her head off!" The shooting stopped. Della held her fire on the ridge, unable to get a clean shot. Jonah froze, 10 yards away, his chest heaving, his gun leveled at Silas. The wind howled through the canyon, whipping Lila's hair across her face. She was not crying. She was breathing hard, her eyes fixed on Jonah. "It is over. Silas," Jonah said. His voice was low, deadly quiet. "The judge is coming. The copy is safe. You have nowhere to go." "I have a hostage," Silas spat. "I will ride out of here, and if you follow me, she dies." "You are not a lawman," Jonah said, stepping forward. "One step. You are a thief. You stole the land. That was greed. But the rations. You stole food from starving women and children. That is not greed. Silas, that is evil." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. The truth of it, the pettiness, the cruelty of starving people just to buy cheap land hung in the air. "They are just Indians," Silas shouted, his face twisting. "They are savages. They do not deserve the land." "They are people," Jonah said, another step. "And I am one of them." He raised the hammer of his Colt. Click. "Shoot me, and she dies." Silas sneered. Lila looked at Jonah. She saw the rage in his eyes, the savage he was so afraid of, but she also saw the man who had taken off his hat in the tack room. "Jonah," she whispered. She did not struggle. She did not scream. She simply went limp. It was a move of pure trust. She dropped her weight entirely, becoming dead weight in Silas's grip. Silas, expecting a struggle, was thrown off balance. He stumbled back, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. That was all Jonah needed. He did not shoot Silas in the head. He did not shoot him in the heart. He fired. The bullet struck Silas's right shoulder, shattering the bone. Silas screamed, dropping the gun. He fell back against the canyon wall, sliding down to the dirt, clutching his ruined arm. Lila scrambled away, crawling toward Jonah. Jonah did not look at her. He walked toward Silas, He kicked the fallen pistol away. Silas was gasping, blood soaking his coat. He looked up at Jonah with terrified eyes. He saw death coming. "Jonah," Silas wheezed. "Jonah, wait! We can make a deal. I have money, gold, in Santa Fe." Jonah stood over him. The muzzle of his Colt was black and hollow, looking like the eye of judgment. The rage was afire in Jonah's blood. This man had hunted him. This man had hurt Eli. This man had threatened to burn Lila. This man had starved his mother's kin. Killing him would be easy. It would be justice. It would be cleansing. Jonah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Do it," Silas whispered, closing his eyes. "Jonah." Lila's hand touched his arm. It was a light touch, the same touch she had used when she handed him the hammer in the barn. "Don't," she said softly. Jonah did not look at her. "He deserves it." "Yes," Lila said. "He does, but you are not him. You made it sacred. Remember, you do not take life unless you have to. You are not a killer. Jonah, you are a protector." Jonah looked at the shivering, bleeding man at his feet. He looked at the fear in Silas's eyes, the total lack of dignity. If he pulled the trigger, he became the thing Silas said he was, a savage, a killer. If he didn't, he remained Jonah Gray, the man who fixed fences, the man who kissed a woman gently in the dark. Jonah exhaled. The tension left his shoulders. He slowly lowered the hammer of the gun. He holstered the weapon. "You are not worth the bullet," Jonah said. He turned his back on Silas. He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. Old army cuffs he had kept for years and tossed them to Lila. "Bind him," Jonah said. Lila nodded. She moved quickly, snapping the cuffs on Silas's good wrist and his ankle, trussing him like a hog. From the canyon entrance, the sound of many horses approached. "Jonah," Della's voice called from the ridge. "Riders, it is the marshal and the judge." Jonah looked at Lila. She was dusty, bruised, and trembling, but she was alive. He reached out and pulled her to him. It wasn't a soft embrace this time. It was fierce, desperate. He buried his face in her hair. "You came back," he murmured into her neck. "You foolish, stubborn woman. You came back. I belong here," she said, echoing his words to Crow days ago. "And I do not let my friends walk into fire alone." He pulled back and looked at her. He ran a thumb over a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "The copy?" he asked. "Did you really copy it?" Lila managed a weak smile. "Every line, by the light of the stove while you were patrolling. I knew you would try to send me away. I wanted insurance." Jonah shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and admiration washing over him. "Remind me never to play poker with you." The sound of hooves grew louder. A column of riders appeared, led by a man with a white mustache and a federal badge, Judge Thaddeus Moore. Della Boone was riding with them, looking triumphant. The judge rode up to where Silas lay moaning in the dirt. He looked at the burning remnants of the ledger, then at the deputy Jonah had cuffed. "Deputy Crow," Judge Moore said, his voice booming, "I have received a very interesting document from Mrs. Boone, a document that alleges fraud, embezzlement, and murder." Silas looked up, his face gray with pain. "It is a lie, a forgery." "We will let a jury decide that," the judge said. "But seeing as you are currently holding a gun on a federal witness, I would say the odds are not in your favor." The judge looked at Jonah. "Mr. Gray, you have had a busy night." Just cleaning up the trash." "Judge," Jonah said, leaning against a rock. He suddenly felt the exhaustion hit him like a hammer. His side was wet. He looked down. A bullet had grazed his ribs. He hadn't even felt it. "Get him a doctor," Lila shouted, seeing the blood. "I'm fine," Jonah said, waving her off. But he swayed. Lila caught him. She wrapped her arm around his waist, taking his weight. "Lean on me," she said. Jonah looked at her. He looked at Eli, who was being helped up by Della. He looked at the dawn beginning to break over the canyon rim, turning the purple stone to gold. "I am leaning," he said softly. The deputies were rounded up. Silas was hoisted onto a horse. His career and his tyranny ended in the dust of the devil's throat. They rode back to the trading post as the sun rose. The journey was slow. When they crested the final ridge, they saw the ranch. Smoke was rising from the barn. The roof of the stables had collapsed. The south fence was a wreck. But the house stood. The chimney was still there. And the kitchen, the heart of it all, was intact. Jonah stopped his horse. He looked at the damage. It would take months to fix. It would take money they didn't have. But then he felt Lila's hand on his own. "We can fix it," she said. Jonah looked at the ruins, then at the woman beside him. He thought of the ledger, burned to ash, and the copy safe in the judge's saddlebag. He thought of the land, scarred but still theirs. "Yes," Jonah said. "We can fix it." He touched the brim of his hat. The nightmare was over. The day had begun. And for the first time in a long time, the wind did not feel cold. The smoke from the burning stables had long since cleared, carried away by the relentless wind of the New Mexico territory. In its place, the air around Boone's trading post was filled with the sense of raw pine, sawdust, and the deep, savory aroma of beef broth simmering on a cast-iron stove. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the fire. 2 weeks after Silas Crow had been dragged away in irons, his shoulders shattered and his empire of paper lies reduced to ash and justice. Lila Hart stood in the kitchen. It was the same room where she had held a bucket of hot ash as a weapon, the same room where she had hidden the ledger that saved them all. But it felt different now. The fear that had lived in the corners, shadowing every creak of the floorboards, was gone. She stirred the large pot on the stove. Her arm ached with a pleasant kind of fatigue. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was cooking. "More pepper," a voice said from the doorway. Lila turned. Red Keene was sitting in a chair by the window, his arm in a sling. He looked pale, but the color was returning to his cheeks, and his appetite had come back with a vengeance. "If I add more pepper, Red, you will breathe fire," Lila said, tapping the spoon against the rim of the pot. "A man needs fire to heal," Red argued, grinning. "Dr. Edwards said I need to stimulate the blood." "Dr. Edwards said you need to sit still and stop trying to lift hay bales with one arm," Lila corrected. The back door opened, and Jonah Gray walked in. He moved a little slower than before, favoring his right side where the bullet had grazed his ribs, but he walked upright. He was not looking at the floor. He was looking straight ahead. He took off his hat as he entered, dusting the brim against his leg. His face was tanned, lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, but the dark, haunted look that had defined him for so long had softened. "The barn roof is framed," Jonah said. "Eli is nailing the shingles now. He hits his thumb every third nail, but he is learning. He is a good boy," Lila said. She ladled a bowl of broth and set it on the table. "Sit, eat." Jonah sat. He did not argue. The dynamic between them had settled into a comfortable rhythm, a silent language of care and respect. He watched her as she moved around the kitchen. She was no longer the terrified girl clutching a Dutch oven like a shield. She was the mistress of this domain. "The judge left town this morning," Jonah said between spoonfuls of broth. "He is taking Silas to Santa Fe for trial. The charge list is longer than a winter night. Fraud, embezzlement, attempted murder." "And the land?" Lila asked. She stopped wiping the counter. "Secure," Jonah said. "The federal surveyors are coming next month to redraw the lines properly. The copy Della made. It held up. The families keep their water rights." Lila let out a long breath. "It is over, then—" "The fighting is over," Jonah said. "Now the work begins." He finished his soup and stood up. "I have to go into town. There is a meeting at the general store. The elders from the settlement are coming down to speak with the town council." Lila looked at him with concern. "Are you sure that is wise people still talk? The rumors Silas spread about you, about the savage intent." Jonah walked over to her. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could smell the cedar shavings on his shirt. "Let them talk," Jonah said. "Silas made them afraid of what they did not know. Today, I am going to show them the truth, I'm going to stand there, Lila. I am not going to hide my face or my blood. I am Jonah Gray. I am a scout, and I am a neighbor. They can accept it, or they can leave. Lila reached out and straightened his collar. You are a brave man. Jonah, I have a good reason to be, he said, his eyes holding hers. The meeting in town was not loud. There were no gunshots, no speeches shouted from balconies. It was a quiet affair in the back room of the Mercantile. Jonah stood at the front of the room. Beside him stood old Aunt Nia, the matriarch of his mother's community. She was small and wrinkled like a dried apple, but her eyes were sharp as obsidian. On the other side of the table sat the town council, the banker, the mayor, the shopkeepers. Men who had looked the other way when Silas Crow was stealing rations. Men who had believed the lies because it was easier than asking questions. Jonah placed a stack of papers on the table. It was not the ledger that was evidence, but it was a list of names. The names of the people who had been starved so that these men could buy cheap land. We are not asking for charity, Jonah said. His voice was calm, the voice of the earth itself. We are asking for trade. We have horses, we have wool, we have leather. You have flour and steel. We can be enemies and bleed for every inch of dust. Or we can be neighbors and trade. The banker shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Gray, surely you understand the hesitation, the history. History is what we wrote yesterday. Jonah said, the future is what we write today. Silas Crow tried to write a future with blood. I am offering one written with a handshake. He held out his hand. The scar on the back of it was visible, a white line against the skin. The room was silent for a long minute. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight. Then, the owner of the feed store, a man who had lost a son to the fever 2 winters ago, stood up. He looked at Aunt Nia. He looked at Jonah. I need wool for the winter blankets, the man said. And I have surplus corn. He reached out and took Jonah's hand. It was not a parade. It was not a festival. It was just a handshake. But in the West, a handshake was stronger than iron. When Jonah rode back to the trading post that evening, the sun was setting, painting the clouds in streaks of violet and gold. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight he had carried for 10 years. He was no longer walking between two worlds. He had pulled them together. He found Lila on the porch. She was painting a sign. It was a piece of flat pine board, sanded smooth. She had painted, in neat, bold letters, the hearth at Boone's Station, and underneath, in smaller letters, meals, rest, sanctuary. Jonah dismounted and tied his horse. He walked up the steps, his spurs chiming softly. New sign, he asked. Lila looked up, a smudge of white paint on her nose. Della agreed. We are not just trading posts anymore. We are a destination. People will come for the supplies, but they will stay for the food. The hearth, Jonah read. I like it. I was thinking, Lila said, setting down the brush. I want my name on the door too. Not as a guest, not as Sarah, as a partner. I have some money saved from my time at the inn. I want to buy a share of the stock. Jonah leaned against the porch railing. You want to stay truly? Lila stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. I spent 3 years running. Jonah, I thought safety was a place where no one knew my name. But I was wrong. Safety is a place where people know your name, and they stand beside you anyway. She looked at the yard, at the mended fences, at the new roof on the barn. I belong here, she said. Jonah reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of soft buckskin. I went to see Aunt Nia after the meeting. Jonah said, I told her about you. I told her about the pot, about the ash, about the canyon. He handed the package to Lila. Lila unfolded the leather. Inside lay a bracelet. It was not gold or silver. It was made of woven sweetgrass and strips of soft, cured leather, dyed in patterns of red and black. In the center was a small, polished piece of turquoise. In my mother's language, Jonah said quietly. We do not have a word for citizen. We have a word for kin. It means someone who shares the fire. Lila ran her finger over the turquoise. It was cool and smooth. She made this for you." Jonah continued, "It is a sign. If you wear this, you walk on our land as one of us. No one will touch you. No one will ask you to leave." Lila felt tears prick her eyes. It was a simple thing, worth perhaps 50 cents in a city store. But here, it was a passport. It was a title. It was a declaration that she was no longer a drifter. "Jonah," she whispered, "it is beautiful. It is a promise." Jonah said, "That you are not alone, not ever again." She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit perfectly. She looked at him, and the love she felt was not the desperate, fiery passion of the night in the tack room. It was something sturdier. It was the love of a foundation settling into the earth. "I have something for you too," Lila said. She took his hand and led him inside. The kitchen was warm. The stove was crackling softly. The smell of the day's baking lingered in the air. Lila led him to the wall next to the stove, right beside where her Dutch oven hung on its sturdy hook. She had driven a new nail into the wood. It was a large iron nail, positioned high up, in a place of honor. "What is this?" Jonah asked. "When you come in here," Lila said, turning to face him, "you are always watching. You are always listening for the wind, for the horses, for the danger. You carry the war with you." "Jonah." She reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "But a home is not a fort," she said softly. "And a husband is not a sentry." The word hung in the air. Husband. They had not spoken of marriage. They had not signed papers. But the promise had been made in the canyon, under the gun. "When you cross that threshold," Lila said, "I want you to hang your hat here. I want you to put down the scout. I want you to be Jonah, just Jonah." Jonah looked at the nail. Then he looked at the woman standing in the light of the fire. He thought of the years he had spent sleeping with one eye open. He thought of the cold nights and the long, lonely trails. He thought of the silence he had wrapped around himself like a shroud. Slowly, he reached up. He took off his hat. He hung it on the nail. It rested there, beside the cooking pot, the symbol of the range and the symbol of the hearth, side by side. Jonah ran a hand through his hair. He felt lighter. He felt exposed, but not vulnerable. He turned to Lila. "Then let me make it sacred," he whispered, echoing the words he had said in the tack room. But this time, he did not mean a kiss. He meant life. He meant waking up and sleeping. He meant the coffee in the morning and the wood chopping in the afternoon. He meant the quiet days that would turn into years. He took her face in his hands. "I am home," he said. Lila smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that broke the last of the shadows in the room. "Welcome home, Jonah." 6 months later, the winter had been hard, as winters in the territory always were. The snow had drifted high against the walls of the trading post, and the wind had howled like a banshee for weeks on end. But inside the hearth, it was warm. Travelers stopped by the dozen now. They came for the supplies. Yes, but they mostly came for the food. They came for the stew that was thick with beef and barley, for the cornbread that tasted like sunshine, and for the feeling of peace that permeated the room. Lila moved among the tables, pouring coffee. She wore a clean blue dress, and on her wrist, a woven leather bracelet. She laughed as Red Keene told a tall tale to a group of freighters, his arm fully healed and his mouth as active as ever. Delaboon was at the counter, arguing happily with a supplier about the price of flour. Eli was outside, showing a young girl how to brush a horse. And in the corner, sitting in a chair by the stove, was Jonah Gray. He was not wearing his hat. It was hanging on the nail. He was mending a bridle, his hands working the leather with easy familiarity. He paused and looked up. He watched Lila. He watched the way she moved, the way she touched a customer's shoulder, the way she commanded the room not with fear, but with grace. She looked up and caught his eye. She did not look away. She smiled, a secret, quiet smile just for him. Jonah smiled back. Outside, the wind blew. It kicked up the dust and rattled the sagebrush. It whispered of ghosts and gold and guns. But the sound did not penetrate the thick adobe walls. The fire in the stove popped. A cheerful, bright sound. Click, hiss. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of life. Jonah went back to his job. The gun on his hip felt heavy, a tool he still carried but no longer worshipped. He knew the world was still dangerous. He knew Silas Crow was in prison, but there would always be other wolves. But he also knew this justice did not always come from a judge's gavel or a bullet. Sometimes, justice was simply a warm kitchen, a woman who dared to tell the truth, and a man who was brave enough to stand beside her and take off his hat. Sometimes, the most sacred thing a warrior could do was to lay down his shield and tend the fire. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the San Augustine plains. The windmill turned slowly, singing its metallic song. Jonah Gray was home, and for the first time in 100 years, the wind sounded like a lullaby. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Jonah and Lila brought a little warmth to your day and reminded you that even in the wildest places, humanity and love can find a way to bloom. If you enjoyed this tale of the West, please take a moment to scroll down and leave a comment. I would love to know where you are listening from. Are you in a busy city, dreaming of the open plains? Or are you somewhere quiet, watching your own sunset? Let's share our stories in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about cowboys, outlaws, and the romance of the frontier, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and keeps the campfire burning. Thank you, and happy trails.